guys, welcome to Telling the Told and Untold. My name is Tshego. This is part 2 of a 2-part series into grooming and sexual abuse in some of South Africa's most elite boys' schools by sports coaches. I got most of my information from a documentary that you can find on Showmax called School Ties, and I will link that down in the description box below. There is also a really amazing podcast that you can listen to called My Only Story by Dion Wiggett that goes into a lot more detail. This video is not intended to shame the schools that I speak about, but just to shed light about what happened within those school walls. Also, if someone has not been found guilty in the court of law, then legally they are not guilty. That is their status. So because of that, in some cases, I will be saying allegedly, and that's not to say that they didn't commit the crime that they're accused of having committed, but just to say that legally they have not been found guilty. In the previous video, we spoke about David McKenzie as well as Colin Rex, who were both sports coaches, water polo coaches at two prominent boys' schools, St. Andrew's College in Makhanda as well as Parktown Boys. And David McKenzie was found guilty of having groomed schoolboys, and Colin Rex was found guilty of over 100 charges, and he is currently in prison. If you haven't watched that video yet, I will link it up here so you guys can watch it. You don't necessarily have to watch that video to understand this one, but it doesn't hurt and it will give you a better understanding when we have our discussion towards the end of this video. Before we go straight into today's case, I also have a few content warnings for you guys. In this video, we do talk about sexual assault, suicide, and this case does involve children. So if that's not something you think you're interested in watching, then this video probably isn't for you. So maybe you can watch some of my other videos or just wait for my next upload. Julio was born on the 8th of January 2002 and he weighed 3.3 kilograms. He was born with these huge brown eyes, and he was described as someone who's very kind, intelligent, and he excelled in everything that he tried. He was also really fascinated by space. Growing up, he was close to his older sister Luciana, and his parents also encouraged him to just try different sports, and Julio ended up loving gymnastics. That was his passion, so much so by just the age of 6 years old, he already had his provincial colors. Julio was also the kind of kid who really didn't have to study that hard and he would still get really good marks. He was also obsessed with just finding out how things worked and designing and inventing everything from water rockets to a go-kart and then building them with his dad. His parents decided to send him to St. John's because they just wanted the best for him and they thought that St. John's was the right school to send him to. So in 2008, Julio started pre-prep at St. John's College. Julio would later tell his mom that St. John's was like the Egyptians and the slaves. And when she asked where he fit in, he would say that he was like an academic scribe. He was respected, but he wasn't really part of the popular crowd. In 2011, Julio started prep school, and when he was around 11 to 13 years old, he and his sister Luciana weren't as close as they used to be. Julio seemed different. He always just seemed really sad, and when he was in grade 6 he seemed reluctant to go back to school. Julio started being withdrawn and he would say that he really didn't feel connected to his body. He also suffered from insomnia, and his mother Teresa thought that it was so strange because Julio would have gymnastics practice, and that practice would be from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. So when he'd get home, he'd be so tired from the long day that he had, and his body would also be physically tired, and he still couldn't fall asleep, and that was just so strange to her. Teresa then decided to make an appointment for him to see the school psychologist, and Julio said that he didn't want to talk to anybody in the school. His mom thought that that was a red flag, and she then decided to get him a therapist that was not part of the school. And Julio started seeing this therapist, and soon the therapist met with his parents, and she told them that she thought it would be better if Julio went to another school. It was also around this time when his mother Teresa got an opportunity to work in Paris, so the family then moved to France. And the first year was a bit challenging because Julio and his sister Luciana still had to just adjust to the new environment that they were in, make new friends. But by the second year, things seemed so much better. Julio seemed back to his old happy self. He made friends, he was thriving, he even had an opportunity to do an internship with the European Space Agency, and things just seemed really, really bright. The Moro family then returned to South Africa, and it seemed as though all the progress that Julio had made had just been reversed, and as though nothing had really changed since they had moved. His parents asked him where he wanted to complete his last 2 years of school, and it just so happened that St. John's had the sixth form program, and it is the section of the school that writes the A-level Cambridge exams. And because that's the education that Julio had been doing when the family was still living in France, it kind of really seemed like a no-brainer. So with that, Julio returned to St. John's in 2019 and started his sixth form. When Julio returned to St. John's, at first he seemed happy, he was making friends, but it also felt like there had been a new wave of anxiety. Sometimes Julio would come back home from school and he had goosebumps all over his body and he was physically shaking. And when Teresa would ask him if he was feeling cold or anything like that, he would just say no, he just didn't understand what was going on with his body. Teresa had a colleague who then referred her to a therapist that was really good with young adults, and soon Julio started seeing this therapist. She then called Julio's parents in and told them that he was suffering from complex PTSD, and it appeared as though he had suffered from a massive trauma. The therapist then asked if there had been anything in Julio's childhood that might have caused him to have this complex PTSD, if there had been any massive trauma. And as his parents just raked their heads trying to find something that might have happened in his childhood, they just couldn't think of anything. They thought about a car accident, maybe a death, hijacking, a break-in, but they just couldn't think of anything. Then the therapist asked if there might have been sexual abuse, and Teresa was completely taken aback because that's not something that she had even thought of. It was not in their realm of possibility, really. So having the therapist question them about that was just a shock. And then the therapist said that it didn't necessarily mean that it had happened. She was just kind of asking, and she just said that she knew that there was something very deep that had hurt Julio, and they couldn't say with certainty that it was sexual abuse, and it was just something that had happened to him that he just didn't want to access. The therapist then said that she would take it very slowly with Julio, and that their main concern would be just trying to get Julio through school and getting him comfortable in his body again. In January 2021, Julio had finished school, and this is when he decided to go talk to his mom Teresa and told her that he didn't want her to be upset with him, but it's just that he needed to go see someone. He didn't want to go to university that year because he was messed up and he just wanted to sort himself out. So on the 5th of January, he began a long-term treatment at an inpatient clinic. And Julio was just doing a lot of soul searching. He was drawing a lot, but his drawings were also very dark, and there was always one of this man. Whilst he was at this treatment center, he had also written in his diary, "There are 1 or 2 things that I haven't shared with anyone yet. I've pushed this into the deepest, darkest corner of my mind and tried hard to delete it from my memory entirely. Saying it out loud makes it real and validates that it actually happened." Later that year, on the 15th of November 2021, St. John's sent out a letter to all of the parents. Because at this point, Julio was not part of the St. John's community anymore because he had finished with school, the Moros didn't get this letter. However, a psychologist that Julio had seen in the past had some learners from St. John see her, and she had seen this letter and she remembered Julio, so she decided to give it to the Moros. And this letter said that there had been an alleged predator at the school. Julio's parents then read the letter to him, and when they read the letter to Julio, he kind of stiffened and he looked down, and then he said, "Oh, so there were other boys too. I wasn't the only one." Julio didn't talk about what happened to him, but he did tell one of his friends that it happened for a long time, and Teresa believes it happened for about 2 to 3 years. The Moros also just asked themselves how they could have missed it, what they didn't see, and just what they could have done so that Julio could have told them. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Julio was in gymnastics along with his older sister. And the Moros didn't shy away from conversations about what could happen and about speaking up. They knew the dangers, and they always thought that if anything were to happen, it would be in gymnastics, because there had been a lot of articles about gymnastics coaches and just the possibility that when you're with your gymnastics coach, sometimes you train for long hours, sometimes you have one-on-one sessions. They always thought that it would be gymnastics, not that it would be rock climbing. When Julio was in prep school, St. John's required all the boys to participate in school sporting activities. And by this time, Julio was already competing in gymnastics at both a national and an international level. But by this point, gymnastics was not a sport that was offered by the school. In his second year at prep school, Julio received a special dispensation excusing him from school sports, and the school even gave him recognition for his achievements. But this exclusion kind of made him feel isolated from his peers, and also Julio in stature was kind of like very small, so the fact that he did a sport that wasn't at the school yet, and the fact that he was so tiny, he became an easy target for bullies, and he was often bullied. There was one occasion though where the bullying went even further than it usually would. Julio had been slapped by one of the learners during class, and his mom wanted him to go to the principal, to go tell the principal about it, but Julio did not want to do this. He did not want to seem as though he was a snitch, and he didn't want to be singled out even more. But Teresa just managed to convince him that they should just have a conversation with the principal about it, and not that the principal necessarily had to take any actions with that other student to further victimize Julio. So they spoke to the principal, and Teresa told him her concerns about Julio being bullied and just his feelings. This is when the principal suggested that Julio have weekly hour-long counseling sessions with the prep's head of pastoral care. And for the rest of this video, we will be calling him Mr. Smith, and that is because he hasn't been named publicly. By law, he cannot be named. Mr. Smith was described as a teacher who was very approachable. He was just very kind. He got along with a lot of the boys. If you got into trouble, you would hope that Mr. Smith would be the one that you would be sent to, because he wasn't that strict of a teacher. Julio would also say that Mr. Smith just had like the best class. He worked in the labs. Mr. Smith had a snake that the students could play with, and he was just a teacher that all the learners really got along with. And I think that's very similar to David Mackenzie as well as Colin Riggs, where they were these teachers in the school that a lot of the learners really liked. They weren't that strict, and the learners could just always go to them and know that nothing really would happen to them because they weren't as strict as the other teachers. It seemed as though Mr. Smith also took a keen interest in Julio and Julio's well-being. He kept in touch with Teresa on WhatsApp about Julio's progress and emotional stability. And in addition to the counseling sessions that Mr. Smith gave Julio, he was also in charge of rock climbing at St. John's. So he would counsel Julio, but he also thought that rock climbing would be a good outlet for Julio. Rock climbing is usually only offered when you're around 12 years old and older, and it's alleged that when Julio started rock climbing, he was just 9 years old. Also, because he was in gymnastics, he had upper body strength, so he could do rock climbing even though he wasn't supposed to. And Mr. Smith would let him climb without telling anybody, and so the secrets between Julio and Mr. Smith began. It was one little secret, and Mr. Smith would tell him, like, don't tell anyone, don't tell your parents, don't tell your friends, and this is how it started. Teresa also became slightly concerned when Mr. Smith would send her WhatsApp messages about Julio going on a camp, and Teresa did not want Julio going on that camp. She just didn't feel comfortable with Mr. Smith being like the only adult there, so Julio didn't go on this camp. But other students did go, and one St. John's learner said that there was a camp that he went on with Mr. Smith, and during this 4-day camp he wasn't feeling that well. He was a bit sick, so he was in one of the cabins when Mr. Smith went to go check on him. Mr. Smith then put his hand on this learner's forehead, just feeling his temperature. He then took his fingers and placed it on the learner's lymph nodes by his neck, which is like here, and then after that he moved his hands into the learner's pants and felt the lymph nodes on his groin area. Even though Mr. Smith couldn't get Julio to go on this camp, he did manage to get Julio to go on a day trip. There was one time where he messaged Teresa and said that he was going on like a day excursion with some other learners and asked if Julio could go with them, and Teresa agreed. Julio left, and as the day progressed, she hadn't heard anything. It was getting darker and she was starting to get worried, and at around 6 p.m. Mr. Smith called her and he apologized. He said that he was so sorry that Julio was late. It's just that they were running late, there was traffic. He still had to drop the other boys at their homes, but they would be there soon. And later into the evening they finally arrived. And as soon as Julio opened the front door, he ran straight to his room and got into the shower. The Moros then invited Mr. Smith inside the house for some coffee, and he kind of gave them this Leatherman, which is, I feel like it's like a pocket knife, and then you open it and then it has like a small blade in it as well. And Mr. Smith said that he wanted to give it to Julio. And Teresa remembers just thinking that was a bit odd, and she was like, no, but like it's your Leatherman, and look, it even has your name engraved on it. But Mr. Smith said that one of the blades were broken and that he had already replaced it, so he didn't mind giving it to Julio. Julio then got out of the shower and he took this Leatherman and he just threw it in the back of his cupboard and didn't really look at it again. On the 26th of May 2022, St. John's released the summary of a report conducted by a retired judge. A lot of this summary report was redacted, and it also said that the feedback that the school had been given was that everything that had been happening with Mr. Smith was an internal matter. And there was also a section of the report that indicated that the school had only become aware of Mr. Smith in October 2021. They also said that there had never been any complaints made about Mr. Smith from any other teacher, parents, or even learners. But in the same paragraph, they said that they had received 2 complaints from other teachers, but they didn't go into further detail about what these 2 complaints were. What was also strange, not only the fact that they contradicted themselves in this report, but some of the St. John's learners would say that they all knew Mr. Smith and everyone kind of had similar stories about him. You could be writing a test and be sitting in the classroom. He would walk in, he would go right behind you, he would kind of just like rub your shoulders. And a lot of learners have similar stories about Mr. Smith doing that. And they find it hard to believe that other teachers didn't know about what he did, and maybe not to the extent that happened with Julio, but something small like him just rubbing learners or touching them. They really believe that teachers knew about that because Mr. Smith kind of had that reputation. After St. John's had released the letter to the parents about them having previously employed an alleged perpetrator, Julio had started seeing another therapist, and the therapist had then went to the school to disclose that Julio was one of Mr. Smith's victims, but Julio himself hadn't went to the school. And then in July, he finally decided to go meet with the school himself in person. 2 months after he met with the head of human resources at St. John's, the Moros received a letter from the headmaster expressing alarm over Julio's suicidal ideation and stating that without any admission of liability, that they would pay for him to go to a high-risk treatment facility. After the Moros got this letter from the school, Julio then decided to go to a police station, and he wrote an affidavit stating that he had been sexually abused by his climbing coach, who he names in this affidavit while he was a pupil at St. John's College during the years of 2011 to the end of 2014, when he was 10 to 12 years old. By this point, Julio had seen so many people. He had seen 8 different therapists, 6 different psychiatrists. He had been hospitalized 12 times for mental health related conditions, including PTSD as well as suicidal ideation, and he had been in treatment for 12 months. His parents also just wanted the best for him, and they were just trying to do whatever they could do to just help him get back on track and to deal with what had happened to him when he was in prep school, when he was still so young, by Mr. Smith. It was also around this time when Julio had been accepted to study at Nova University in Portugal for specialized physics engineering. So there were just all these exciting things happening, this new chapter of his life, but Julio was just really struggling with what had happened to him. His mental health also appeared to be deteriorating even further. So about 2 months after the Moros had received this letter from St. John saying that they would pay for Julio to go to a high-risk facility, the Moros decided to take them up on their offer. Julio's sister Luciana then dropped him off on the 19th of October 2022, and Julio was really upset. They think for him, he had been seeing so many different people, and it seemed as though he was not making any progress, and he was just so tired of constantly seeing one professional after the other and him seemingly not improving. When he got to this high-risk facility, the treating psychiatrist said that he was going to stop all of the medication that Julio was taking, and Teresa remembers thinking like, oh, that's a bit strange, like just stopping everything at the same time. But for her, she thought, okay, this is the treating psychiatrist, he's a professional, he knows what he's doing, let's just see what's going to happen. But it just didn't seem like it was getting better. There were times where Julio would call his sister and tell her that the nurses were not managing his medication correctly. Julio had sent his mama a message once saying that he was climbing the walls because he felt like a caged animal and he just didn't know why, and he wanted her to speak to the doctor to just give him something to calm him down. On the 5th of November, it was Julio's dad's birthday, and his sister Luciana went to go buy a chocolate cake, and they thought it would be such a great idea for them to have this cake to go see Julio and celebrate their dad's birthday together. Whilst she was in Woolies looking for this cake, she received a phone call from Julio and he was yelling at her. So she told him that if he's going to speak to her like that, then she's not going to speak to him, and then she dropped the phone. Just as they were about to leave to go and see Julio, Teresa received a phone call from his psychiatrist, and he told her that Julio had tried to hang himself with his belt. The family then got into the car and they drove as fast as they could to get to this high-risk facility to go see Julio and make sure that he's okay. And Luciana remembers that at this time, Julio had tried to take his life before, and she had somewhat become just kind of desensitized to it, because it would be like, okay, he tried to do this, we are going to see him, we're going to work through it together and everything will be fine. And that's just what she thought, and that they'd get through it as a family. But this time that wouldn't happen. On their way to this facility, Teresa decided to call the psychiatrist just to check if Julio was okay, and the psychiatrist said that he wasn't okay, that the paramedics had tried to resuscitate him, but they couldn't, and Julio was gone. The Moros then got to the facility, they rushed down to go see Julio, and he was still lying on the floor. The plywood on the roof had been pulled off, and he was wearing his favorite striped shirt. His body was still warm, and Teresa couldn't believe that he was gone. He died 2 months before his 21st birthday. He also left a note. 9 days after Julio took his own life, the school released a statement on his passing, and in that statement, for the models, it feels as though they were just trying to cover their bases, because they only spoke about Julio for about 2 paragraphs, and then the rest of it was the school giving the learners and the parents an update on the ongoing case against Mr. Smith. Julio had made his identity known to the school in absolute confidentiality, and the family was guaranteed that. But in the letter that they gave out, they made a direct link between Julio and Mr. Smith. The school would later say that they were not the ones to make the direct link first, but that Julio's friends and family had made the direct link on their social media accounts. On the 9th of October 2023, Mr. Smith appeared in court for the first time. 10 survivors of his abuse had come forward. 8 months after Mr. Smith appeared in court for the first time in June 2024, the criminal charges against him were temporarily dropped so that the case could be centralized. And this finally happened in November 2024. But up to 2 decades after the abuse began for many of the St. John's victims, they are still awaiting a sit-down date in the Johannesburg High Court. More recently, as in February 2025 of this year, Mr. Smith was arrested in his home in Craighall, and he was charged with sexual grooming as well as sexual abuse. It turns out that in 2006, he allegedly abused another young boy, and this boy was not a learner who went to St. John's. However, what happened to him did allegedly take place at St. John's. His case was postponed to the 8th of April, and Mr. Smith is currently out on 10,000 Rand bail. I thought that was just interesting that everything happened and a letter came out, and now someone else came forward, someone who was not even a learner at the school. When they decided to look at Mr. Smith's history, they discovered that he wasn't just a rock climbing coach, but he was also part of the water polo community. And this just raised even more questions about water polo and the types of people that become a part of that community and the access that it gives these coaches to learners. We have Mr. Smith, there's Colin Riggs, there's David McKenzie, there's Dean Carsley, and so many other more water polo coaches. What makes water polo such a different sport where all these predators are able to be a part of it and to use it to their advantage? About 2 in 5 boys in South Africa are sexually abused before the age of 18. And of those boys, 20% are abused by teachers. Those reporting traumatic childhood experiences such as sexual and physical abuse are 2 to 5 times more likely to attempt suicide. Boys are also less likely to speak out because they don't want to be seen as weak, and very often boy children don't want to disappoint their parents. There's also this stigma around boys and sexual abuse. We saw it in the Colin Riggs case, where one of the Parktown boys had been violated by Colin Riggs, but because he's a boy and Colin Riggs was a man and he's water polo coach, he didn't tell his dad about it because he didn't want his dad to think that he's gay. When a child has also been sexually abused, it's also important to understand that it takes time for them to speak about what happened to them, to understand what they went through. We saw this again in the Colin Rex case, where Colin Rex was arrested and they had to speak to the learners about his arrest and ask if any of them had been violated by him. How Jason Daly, who was older, had to speak to some of the younger boys about what happened to them, to try and make them understand that they had been sexually assaulted, to make them understand that what happened to them wasn't okay. Often at times, if someone is also sexually abused, they begin to disassociate. Their brain tries to forget what happened, but your body will still remember, your body will still see a certain place and be triggered by that. And we saw that with Julio. Julio went to school, he went back to St. John's. Mr. Smith was long gone, and it had been a few years, but he would get home and his body would be covered in goosebumps. He would be shivering because his body remembered, his body saw it as not a safe space to be in, and his body reacted because of that. According to Luke Lampard, the head of advocacy at Women and Men Against Child Abuse, to prevent grooming and potential abuse and to ensure that educators who are abusing children are reported, educators, caregivers, and children need to recognize violations of professional boundaries. Schools should also use training and performance management to manage boundary violations. And if a teacher violates these boundaries, then disciplinary actions should take place. We saw this with David McKenzie. David McKenzie breached those boundaries. David McKenzie would speak to the boys on WhatsApp. He would speak to them like he's their friends, and those clear boundaries were violated. More than that, more than just having disciplinary actions against those teachers that violate those boundaries, the school is obligated to report teachers to SAPS or to the Provincial Department of Social Development and to SACE if they have reasonable suspicion of grooming. Regardless of internal processes within those schools, the schools still need to report what happened to the relevant people. For example, with David McKenzie decided to resign with immediate effect after he heard that he was going to have a disciplinary hearing. And because he didn't face this disciplinary hearing, because the school did not take the correct action and go to the appropriate external parties, David McKenzie was able to go to 2 or 3 other schools and still work as a water polo coach. And because schools don't properly vet the people that they're hiring, then these predators are able to slip through the cracks. And because sometimes, like David McKenzie, they could have 3-4 complaints against them, and these are not taken seriously, these are not taken further, then David McKenzie was able to go to another school, and instead of the school just like calling St. Andrews to ask about him and to get these formal complaints, he was able to go to another school and potentially do even more harm. SACE also urges principals to hand over cases of a sexual nature that take place in the school to authorities who have the best expertise of dealing with the matter. But sometimes schools say they're going to do something, but they just don't. In 2018, Parktown Boys had the Harris Newman Mulibadzi report, and in this report it detailed what they found about the school, about grooming, sexual abuse, and they also named several educators. They were told that once the school, the learners and their parents have read the report, then this report would be made public for anyone to read, for anyone to have access to. It has now been 7 years and no one has read that report. And it is believed and alleged that some of the teachers who were named in this report, who were said to be alleged perpetrators, groomers, that nothing was done to them and they are still in those schools. And even if you can say that one school needs to vet whoever they hire, if things like that aren't made public, then what can they do to ensure that they get the most reliable information about a teacher and not hire them and not put them in their schools? Parktown Boys also developed a safety bell that is supposed to be rang when a student starts grade 8, and once they're done with school in matric, they ring the bell again. And the safety bell was hung up after Colin Riggs for the learners that were violated by him, but also to just try and make sure that learners pledge to not bully other learners, to pledge that Parktown Boys will be a safe school. However, it said that the parents took down this bell because they didn't believe that the safety would be honored. South Africa has just under 450,000 teachers. 3.6% of teachers have a criminal record. 3.6% equates to 16,000 teachers. Of that 3.6%, 2.63% are crimes of abuse or a sexual nature. According to the Education Labour Relations Council, in the 18 months from April 2023 to October 2024, 65 educators in South Africa were fired for sexual misconduct. Despite the 65 being reported to the Department of Social Development to be listed on the National Child Protection Register as persons deemed unfit to work with children, only 16 of the 65 were deregistered with SACE. Without them being deregistered, there is the possibility that those educators that were fired could just continue teaching at other schools, and this is made possible because the Child Protection Register is known for being out of date, and also not all schools have recent Form 29s for all of their staff. The sad reality is that where there is a school, you will most likely find a predator. And this is because abusers position themselves where they are most likely to identify and exploit their victims. I think another great example of what can happen in schools that is so recent is Tshego, who is a 7-year-old girl who was brutally violated, and her mother is going through great lengths to ensure that justice is served. If you haven't signed the petition yet, please do sign it. I will link it down in the description box below, and I will also pin it as a comment. What happened shouldn't have happened, and the reality is that she was most likely not the first. We should make our schools safer for children. They should already be safe because that's where they spend most of their time in. There shouldn't have to be public outcry for a case to be taken seriously and for something to be done. We shouldn't have to have children fighting for their peers to have justice. More should be done. Our kids should be protected and schools should be safe. And that's it for today's case. I did become a bit passionate. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps out my channel a lot, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.